This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Donelle Boose, who teaches in the Department of History and in the African American Studies program at Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, Virginia. She is an historian who works between public history, archival research, and Black studies sensibilities. In this conversation, we discuss the relation between public-facing work and Black study, documentation and evidence in popular and academic historical writing, and the transformative nature of the Black studies classroom. Hello, Donelle. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. End of the day, beginning of the week, all of those things. Been really looking forward to this chance to talk to you about how you think about the field of Black studies, hear a little bit about your work, thinking about the future of the field, the past of the field, all of that. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Just to say at the outset, I really appreciate you taking the time. I really feel like the people in September who record these podcasts are a little bit of academic culture heroes because we're all got so much going on. But I appreciate your time and really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So obviously we'll get to talking about how you imagine the field of Black studies, your work, and these kinds of questions. But I wanted to start with a more personal question and just invite you to narrate a little bit for us how you got interested in Black studies, how you got interested in the study of Black life more broadly. And always a question for me, what sustains you in that study and in that commitment to the field?
Well, let's just start with how I got into Black studies. And I think the best way to describe it is to say that I was asking Black studies questions when I was in high school. And it was because I was in an environment where my lived experience didn't match the society that was being described to me in high school. I grew up working class in a Black working class neighborhood, but I was trapped in high school. And so by the time of my high school years, I was in a classroom space that was fairly middle class and racially white predominantly. And so trying to understand these different experiences, I was curious. I had questions. I was also in a cultural mix where I was hearing new music. I don't know if you remember this, but in the 90s, late 90s in particular, this was the era of free music because there was not yet streaming, but there was downloading that was happening.
LimeWire.
That's right. And so all of this music that I was not able to access prior to this because, you're limited to the radio. Like I heard what the DJs played, and so I'm listening to like pop music essentially. And here I have an opportunity to hear other kinds of music and hip hop, because that was something that, me and my friends just wanted to hear. We wanted to hear hip hop, and we didn't have a hip hop and R&B station. And so, we were able to hear music. And what I started to hear was the Fugees, and they are making this music that is popular, but it's also political. So they're saying on their album, War in the Town, the beast is loose. And they're talking about the extrajudicial practices of police forces. And I'm 12, 13 years old, and I'm learning, They're also referencing Bob Marley, who, had a pop presence, right? I would hear his music probably in commercials and this kind of thing, but I didn't have a reference really. I remember my grandmother saying, "I shot the sheriff," and I didn't know what it meant. It was just like a thing, right? But, the Fugees directed my interest and I had access to it, so I opened up this world of cultural products that are making these intellectual critiques. At the same time, there are Black film And it's, really an important period in Black film in the 1990s. So you get movies like Higher Learning that are talking about what racial experiences are like in the United States, and with a particular emphasis on Black student experiences. You get, movies like Boys in the Hood, right, that are making a critique on what the society is like for young Black boys in their attempt to grow into manhood. Even earlier than that, you get like Spike Lee's Malcolm X, and all of these things I'm interested to understand. And so the seeds were laid really in that period for me, so that when I went off to college, it's an unprecedented opportunity for me to learn all kinds of new things. And that's one of them. In my mind, I'm like, I'm going to learn more about, this Black stuff too.
Yeah.
And so I take my first courses. I think my very first class was African American history. And I'm hooked. I really want to know more. And I did my undergrad at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, but I didn't start there. My very first year, I was at Emerson College in Boston. And so they had very limited offerings in terms of Black studies. But when I transferred, the world opened up. And I had really important encounters with professors. I had Professor Reginald Hildebrand for African American history. I had Professor Parry Hall, who's now passed away, but a really important foundational thinker in the field of Black studies, who's teaching me about civil rights. And it just ignited something in me, just an interest that I couldn't let go. When I was at UNC, I was thinking I needed to major into something that would get me a job, right? A job was the name of the game. I didn't have a concept that I didn't have to be so career focused there until I encountered Reginald Hildebrand, right? Dr. Hildebrand. I said, I think, I really like this. I want to minor in this. And he says, well, why not major? And I was like, why not? And so I did. And I have been in love with it since then, So I think that's the intellectual trajectory. I had a little detour. I wouldn't even say detour, right? I did nonprofit work when I graduated from my undergrad. That was my first career work. And I was doing college access work, supporting students as they made their way into colleges. But I never could let go. I'm like getting home from work and I'm tired because it's nonprofit. That means the hours are long, right? And in my free time, I'm watching documentaries, And so I'm still nurturing that interest, and that led me back to do the master's program at Cornell University.
I love that. This is my favorite part of these podcasts, actually, is hearing how people get drawn into the study of Black life and Black studies, which, I think it's really interesting listening to how those two things followed each other so nicely, like interest in Black life around both the sense of, I don't want to say, overstate it, but a form of alienation, right? Or not belonging or unsure belonging in the sort of classroom setting, but also finding these moments of belonging that also have political and cultural messaging in music, right? And this question of like, is this just sort of my entertainment and my sort of personal plight? Oh, it turns out there's a whole field of study that explores all the implications of all of these things. I love that. And just the chance of a transfer to a place like UNC Chapel Hill is kind of remarkable that way. Yeah.
Yeah, that, that I had the foresight to make the transfer at the end of my first semester, I think was really important. I have a tendency to try to stick a thing out, but I knew pretty immediately that there was more that I wanted to get from my learning experience that wasn't going to be offered at that institution. And so I'm originally from Virginia. I'm from a place called Lynchburg, Virginia, which is not too far from North Carolina. And my father's family is from North Carolina. My father is like born Tar Heel. And so this is how I ended up there. But then, I get there and, UNC has its own tradition of activism for the establishment of Black studies. And so I landed just in a really great place to nurture that. What I didn't get was someone telling me like, well, maybe you should be more practical. I didn't get that. I got encouragement to explore my intellectual curiosity. And I think that was important.
Yeah. Boy, I cannot tell you how much I relate to this. To this thing of like sticking something out. I mean, it's a pathology with me. So when you said that, I'm like, yeah, I would like to go back and revise some things because of that. So it's amazing that just that sense of fate of like pulling the parachute on something like Emerson College, which is no small deal to be going to school in Boston. It's sort of iconic out of films, et cetera, and then end up in that particular place. It also helps to go to a very, exciting institution. I mean, UNC has multiple kinds of excitements around that. Yeah.
It does indeed. It does indeed.
Well, let me ask you then about the field of Black Studies, talking about it as an undergraduate and doing a master's at Cornell University. And then, as of course, part of your professional workplace now. And so I want to ask you how you think of the field of Black Studies, and specifically in terms of its origin story, right? That is, the origin story of Black Studies has these two elements that have a tense relationship, right? There's the origins of Black Studies, which comes from the discontent around disciplines not supporting or facilitating the study of Black life. And so Black Studies is an intervention and a demand to say, like, we need to develop a study of Black life on college campuses to appreciate the Black intellectual tradition, to expand it, to theorize it, et cetera, right? But then there's also that moment in the late 1960s and early 1970s that's really around reconfiguring the relationship between intellectual work and militant struggle and community struggle for Black liberation, which really was a demand for Black studies as a way of developing a set of prescriptions for those political movements. And that reconfiguring, as I said, that relationship between the campus and politics, the campus and community. And so we are 50-something years out from that. And so I think it's a really interesting time to look back and also look at our present moment and think, like, what do we all think? That's part of the impetus of this series. What do we all think about Black Studies, what it is? And so asking you that, but also in the context of its origins, which are both long and far in the past in some ways, but also are things that continue to animate our own anxieties about politics and culture today.
That's a great question. And I have to say, before I even tell you my answer, that I've been strongly influenced by my experience at Cornell's Africana Center. I studied there under Dr. James Turner. I studied there with also Dr. Natalie Crawford, Dr. Ali Mazrui. There were still these legends who were there that I had an opportunity to sit with, think through things with. And I think that has profoundly shaped how I think about Black studies as a field of intellectual pursuit and more. And so, to my mind, Black studies is a pursuit of knowledge. Black studies as a pursuit of knowledge and as activism exists to create a space for Black people to contemplate and even plot to achieve power in society. And it's a power in society for the benefit and the well-being of the greater group, right? I think that's a key purpose of Black studies. It's about achieving a power for Black people that gives them space for space and ability to make decisions and to control resources, and therefore to really live. Right? If you can make decisions, you control resources, you can live, and you can live for yourself, right? In community, and the alternative is to be a servant. And I think that's a charge of Black studies. I think Black studies operates in opposition to the Western conception of hyper and celebration of hyper individualism, because it's against the tradition to sacrifice community, society for personal gain, for power, right? Or even just personal gratification, right? It is this focus on a collective. And also I'll say that, because of my training in Black studies, I have this view that the idea of knowledge for knowledge's sake really doesn't make much sense, because we know how knowledge is harnessed for power, and often power to dominate others, especially Black people. And so when I think about Black studies and I think about folks who are proponents of Black studies, I think we should recognize that Black studies is dead in the water if it's not an endeavor that's actively connected to and supporting the empowerment and well-being of Black peoples, right, as groups. In other words, if there's no clear political impact, then we have a tradition that's unmoored from its roots, and it could be some kind of integration studies or Western studies or something, right? But I don't think that it still remains to be Black studies. I think I'll just say finally that Black studies empowers Black people so that they can live on their own terms in wellness. And this wellness implies space for a life of the mind too. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic way of characterizing the field. I really like so many things about that. And I will say, I think it's a fourth or fifth podcast I've done where James Turner features in some
legend.
Relation to people. So
absolute legend.
I really love that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A couple of students of his. I know I did a podcast with two doctoral students at Cornell, and they were working on a James Turner reader, and so it's just good to have I obviously can't put James Turner, rest in peace, in this podcast, but it's wonderful to have his name come up in so many different kind of affirmative ways. I love that. And I think, that the way you were talking about Black studies and study as related to power and empowerment, that's such an interesting movement back and forth in your comment. And not movement back and forth across opposites, but movement back and forth in terms of just thinking about what it means to study a tradition, to find yourself in a tradition, and how that actually translates into social and political bearing on the world in some fundamental way.
Mm-hmm.
And, if I understood you correctly, for me, that really reconfigures that sense of there being a conflict between intellectual traditions and political activism, that they have an intimacy there, that maybe this origin point is not so oppositional.
Yeah, I don't think, I certainly don't see it as opposition. I see, how can you have, I can't think of a Black intellectual tradition that is not connected in some way with the empowerment of Black people in the societies. It's hard for me to think of it in that way.
Yeah, I love that. Let me shift in a little bit and to ask you about your own work in relation to the field of Black studies. Your own work is interested in historical study, obviously has its methods and its foundational texts, public history. And as you've already talked about, your orientation is very much informed by Black studies sensibilities. A master's degree is not just a credential, it's a way of becoming a thinker and teacher. So I'm interested in how, for you think about the work that you're doing as an intellectual in relation to the past of Black studies? How do you see it situated in the tradition? But also, in what ways do you see the work you're doing maybe opening up new horizons in the field?
Let's see, opening up new horizons. Let me think about that. Let me say this about public history and traditional history, right? So I did a PhD in U.S. history, and a minor field was public history and African American history. So these are the things, and I have been trained in the historian's method, and I find it useful. I find it very, very useful for my Black studies work. But I won't say that my work doesn't exist without tensions. I think there are absolutely tensions. I think when I lean most into the principles of Black studies, right, if I lean in that very intensely, I'm almost dancing on the line of apostasy for the discipline of history. I think that I could be charged with presentism. I don't pretend that I'm not invested in Black liberation fights that I examine. And I'll just give it an example. Like I have a podcast documentary called The Disappearing of Sister Coco. And it's about a Black Power activist by the name of Sister Coco. And the narrative of this documentary podcast turns on the fact that this important historical figure who's been forgotten by most must be remembered. And I argue that she must be remembered because she demonstrates that everyday people move the needle towards liberation. And I argue that this woman who, at the time that I first started the project, was working, she was literally just working at I think it was Reagan's, airport in a clothing shop there. So people are passing by her every day, having no sense of the importance of her work and activism as this global freedom fighter. And so I use this podcast to celebrate the everyday person as freedom fighter, and so although I use the methods of history to try to get at the story, I consider it a Black studies work. I think it is a project that puts history for use in the public, but I am interested in people acting,
Yeah.
And so I'm not a dispassionate chronicler or analyzer. The narrative is an endorsement of Black freedom struggle, and I think that for and thinking of it as a work of Black studies, I see it as fitting the tradition, and doing some of the best work of the tradition and the urging of those who hear and think about the podcast to do something, And so it's certainly not traditional history. I can joke that because of the development of public history, I haven't been run out of the discipline. I can kind of find this niche,
Gives you a little bit of like a little tent to run under.
Yeah. I keep a foot in these two worlds. Public historians. If you think about the National Council of Public Historians, they even in their platform, have space for activism, and so this is how I walk the line, because I think I'm certainly going to be very much concerned with historical context. I'm certainly going to do deep work to verify the history of primary sources so that I can make sure that this is a narrative of truth. But I can't let go of my Black studies leanings and how I understand it, because I did have that master's at Cornell first,
Yes.
and I had that African American studies undergrad degree first. This is a key part of my intellectual orientation. And I think that the value is that I can use various media to tell histories in modes that can connect with people outside of lecture hall. So, I remember I was in grad school and the history program in a public history class. And the question was posed, who are the publics that you're aiming to reach? And the public that I constantly have in mind is my brother and my sister, right? So I need to be able to generate work that's going to reach them where they are and not expect that they will come to where I am.
Yeah, no, that's, I think about you said this podcasted series, right, as a form of public history. I mean, that in itself, I think, is a really interesting way of thinking about both how something folds into the tradition of Black studies, which is about that relationship between knowledge and the public, knowledge and community. But also, I do think this is something I hope to see more of in the field, which is using these, let's be honest, very basic technologies. You plug in your microphone, you talk, you edit a little bit, and then you upload, right? But it has such an potentially enormous impact, right? As you said, really to the principles, the founding principles of Black studies. And I love that word that you used, endorsement, that the narrative is an endorsement of liberation struggle. I love that idea of endorsement. I'm actually going to I've taken so many things from these podcasts, and I'm like, I will footnote everybody, I promise, in my classes. Not really writing, who knows with writing, but as a way of characterizing these. I really love that, like the idea that the story that's being told endorses something. And so that's the connection. It's not me imposing it or overriding it with a quote unquote agenda. I really like the idea of the narrative endorsing. So thank you for that. If nothing else, it's made this conversation well worth it for me. Well, this is sort of, similarly related, but maybe even expanding here from your intellectual work to also talk about your classroom work. I'm interested in, you've already described your journey where you work in a department of history, or your PhD work was in a department of history. You have your master's degree in Africana studies, and now you're in a history department, but also work in Black studies. And so there's this interesting movement between discipline and area studies. And I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about how you think that's impacted your own sense of yourself as a writer and thinker, to be both in discipline and area studies, because they ask very different things and allow very different things. But also your classroom, how do we construct a syllabus? How do we construct conversations? And all of those things that come with teaching, which are related to being in area studies and being in disciplines. So how has that interplay between discipline and area studies been for you as a writer and teacher, let's say?
So I'm in a history department and I teach for the Black Studies program, right? And so I have the institutional security of this department that is history. I wish that there were more departments in Black Studies that would provide the nurturing environment for scholars to be able to do just Black Studies work. But these are financial realities. In fact, part of the reason that I didn't do the PhD program in Black Studies, though I wanted to, was that I had a real problem when I finished with just the master's degree. One, because it was just a master's degree and not the doctoral degree. But I had an issue with trying to land employment. And then you have, the basic prerogative to survive is really important. And so, especially when you're thinking about people who are coming from working class backgrounds, right, which a good number of Black Americans are, right? And so I actually took a bit of time, and I did. I worked back in the nonprofit field while I tried to regroup, and so I decided when I returned that, in terms of being able to practically secure a job, a more traditional discipline would help me to do that. That's how I landed in history. Now I have a passion and interest in the past, right, and the analysis of the past. And so it wasn't purely where can I get a job, right?
Sure.
But where could I do the kind of work that I care about And I knew about public history by this time. So I knew that there was some room for me to be able to do the kind of work that I was interested in doing. So I landed the PhD program, I do the history program, and I found it incredibly useful, incredibly insightful. I find the historian's method to be really, really important. And so I'm glad that I did it. But I'm also glad that I had that my first training in those Black Studies contexts. So now I teach history courses, and many of them are cross-listed. Almost all, the majority of them can be cross-listed. So they're well, I take that back. So I teach Black in the Black Studies class. I teach Introduction to Black Studies, which there's tons and tons of interest for. So I get to teach it regularly, and I don't get an opportunity to teach the higher level Black Studies classes, which is a bummer for me. I get to teach a seminar for seniors, and this class is really important and special to me because we can, this is what we think about those, talk a lot about the intellectual tradition. This is where we really get into the intellectual tradition. And I give them an opportunity for them to imagine themselves and place themselves in that intellectual tradition. So, but I don't have a whole lot of opportunity to press further with that because I am ultimately housed in the history department. And I have really supportive colleagues that make space for me to do the Black Studies classes that I can get students for, all right, because it's a small liberal arts college. But ultimately, the institution can say, hey, we need you to teach, U.S. history. Come on down, And then I have to do that, right? And so this is part of the reason that I wish that there were more opportunities, especially for newer scholars that are coming to have the opportunity to teach within Black Studies programs. I feel like I lost track of your question there. Do you want to?
Well, yeah, I mean, so, maybe sort of on that note, I was just going to follow up and ask, even in constructing those history courses, how do you feel like that Black Studies background changes perhaps how you teach them about evidence, how you teach them even about methods, right? Because the methods of an area study are often not, I don't want to be dramatic and say like completely different, but they have different resonance than disciplinary methodologies and senses of what counts as evidence, what counts as a document, and so forth. I mean, in some ways, I even think about your introduction of yourself, right? You were asking Black Studies questions because you were saying, who is this Bob Marley guy who the Fugees are talking about?
Yeah.
Right. And that's different than like a history question.
Oh, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think, I can pull in way more in the introduction to Black Studies class and in the Black Studies seminar. And I do. I will absolutely pull in a film clip. I will absolutely draw in a song. I will absolutely pull up a TikTok post, and we will use that as a starting point of analysis and compare it with the course readings that we have that day, right? We're going to talk about Audre Lorde. Okay, let's talk about this conversation that just happened about the Oscars in relationship to Audre Lorde. I have the freedom to do that in a Black Studies course, and it's really, really important to me. I don't have that same freedom when I'm teaching my, standard African-American history since 1865, right? I do feel more confined, but I work within those confinements. I'm gonna dig. I'm gonna find, the juiciest, the most interesting primary sources that I can find to spark the interest of the students in my history courses. But I part of my lament is the kind of freedom that I get to freely be presentist when I'm doing my intro to Black Studies work.
Yeah, I mean, and I asked the question and that particular follow-up, in some ways it's autobiographical. Like I got my PhD in philosophy, and it's, I've spent 20 or so years, 20 something years in Black studies, having moved from philosophy, and just the way a syllabus is constructed around materials, the way writing documents its claims, that shift has been amazing. But I also have always thought that the tension it has with disciplinary training is kind of productive in itself. It's definitely made me more aware of what I'm doing, right? I don't want to be melodramatic, but there is that moment where it's like, this feels like rebellious to be introducing, like a TikTok, right? To or a Vine in the olden days.
Vines.
If I age myself very quickly, introducing that as a way of doing theory or something like that. That tension, I think, also highlights how dispersed and rich and really kind of boundless the Black Studies archive is. And it's only that sense of boundlessness that comes from the tension that it with more bounded ideas of what archives are, what evidence is. So now I'm turning myself into the guest of the podcast, but I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying in that movement between, history and teaching in Black Studies. So now we've talked about sort of what Black Studies, is doing in classroom, your own work in relation to it. I want to ask you maybe this sort of big picture question, which is, what do you think Black Studies has done well as a field? And what is something you think it has not done so well?
Well, I mean, I think that folks with an engagement with Black Studies go out into the world and they use those insights to really powerful effect, I think. I think we have folks who are highly influential in seeding our society's awareness of historical and ongoing structural inequality, especially regarding racism. I think this awareness has created space for questioning and possible transformation. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean by folks who I think who've gone off, who were connected to Black Studies and have gone off and had really influential done influential work in terms of awareness, right? Aaron McGruder, right? So Aaron McGruder went to the University of Maryland.
I was going to say University of Maryland graduate,
that's right.
yes.
That's right. And he's been highly influential in American pop culture with his Boondocks comic strip. And he's able to use it to make these criticisms of racism and anti-Blackness in U.S. society. And I think he encourages his audiences to think about the unexpected ways that racism and anti-Blackness emerges. But he also complicates our understandings of Black life. We have to look at it with complexity when we're dealing with the art that he's putting out in the world. And he's a product of African American studies, right? Like it's this kind of thinking that's helping, supporting the kind of work that he's putting out in the world, making all of these people think, right? I think about a person like Samuel L. Jackson, right, who got expelled from Morehouse trying to get Black Studies established there. Okay, so he's connected to this legacy, and he never gets to finish Morehouse because he gets expelled for that work, right? But he takes those insights, that understanding with him to his other career path, right? And so, now he's in the filmmaking world and he's doing this work of embodying all of these various kinds of people, but this Black skin, right? And as he's doing it, he's pushing against these boxes, these stereotypical boxness of what Blackness, Black people, Black life could be. And I think it's really important, right? We could take Sonia Sanchez, right? One of the founding professors working at San Francisco State. When Black Studies got started there. And here she is in her, I believe, 90s now, right? And she is still highly influential in arts and cultures arena, right? Making art, talking about art, and through it, pushing us to reimagine the world, right? To imagine a world that's a liberatory one, and how we can support bringing that kind of world about, right? And these are people who with connections to Black studies who we recognize, and we can see their influence in the society, right? They are pushing people over time, right? Many people to question the normalization of racist limitations on Black lives, right? Questioning us, seeding us to think about, does the society have to exist in the way that it exists, and can it be something different? Can it be transformed? And so I think that that's the power. Well, Black Studies produces folks who have who are engaged in efforts that I think can transform society. I'll say that. And I think that Black Studies does that well. It cultivates a critical lens in the folks who go through that training, and they take that with them into their various arenas. And I think that's important. Now, something that I don't think that Black Studies does so well is to harness those people. I think that there are very many who have engaged in Black Studies seriously, even if they never minored or majored in it. They had a serious engagement with Black Studies. And I think about a person, for example. This is a new person. Her name is Lene. I think her last name is Vinny. Are you familiar with her?
No,
Lene,
I
Vinny?
don't think so.
So she's a social media influencer, right? I guess this the best term to explain it. And she uses her Black Studies training to make TikTok videos, to make Instagram videos that are, pick a pop culture, a phenomenon, a news event, right? And she gives a Black Studies read, and she's grown her audience exponentially to the point that she's, now connected with major endorsement deals. Now, we could talk about like the capitalism of it, right? But I think what she is doing is she's asking her audience to question the society as it exists. And like Sonia Sanchez, imagine a new one, right? And so we have these folks that are connected to Black Studies in some way, but we are, I think, not organized in a way to be able to demonstrate that effect in the larger society, where people can immediately think about like, folks get a medical degree, right? And then they go out in the world and they have an association that here are people who are out here making a tangible contribution to the society. And they can see it, right? White coat or, whatever, right? But with Black Studies, I think we get this kind of invisibility, right? And so that we are out in the society doing important work, but we're not actually being able to make the case that, and when I'm thinking about making the case, I'm thinking about making the case to younger people who might also want to do Black Studies or explore the idea,
Well, let me, I will email you this separately, but I want this person's, I really want this person's name, because this actually be a really interesting person to have on this podcast, which is not just professors. I mean, we've started out there because that's our vernacular and workplace, but, activists and artists are absolutely part of our plans ongoing. So, and I think, what you're hitting on is this sort of interesting, the Sonia Sanchez example is really especially interesting to me. I mean, personally, my office when I was at Amherst College was her former dining room, because she was one of the early members of the Black Studies department at Amherst College. So, I have I love Sonia Sanchez's work, and to be that relevant and that creative in your 80s is just amazing. But that moment of the founding of Black Studies and people like Sonia Sanchez who were doing such intensely important public work with their poetry, but also doing the work of establishing departments. I mean, thinking about holding ourselves to that standard, which is not a new standard, that's an old standard.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very interesting and difficult thing to take on, right? In the sense of, like, it's a question that puts for me anyway, I just speak for myself, puts a lot of anxieties at my doorstep. It's like, what are we doing well? What aren't we doing well? I mean, that's the question. And you brought us right to that. I love that. Yeah. Let me ask you, and this is almost like a futurist question, very speculative question about the future. One of the questions I have about Black Studies is, what would be our sign of its ultimate success in the future? Would it be that Black Studies essentially fixes one of its origin stories, which was the disciplines don't study Black life in any kind of serious way? Is the ultimate success of Black Studies to have so transformed the disciplines that it's not really necessary anymore? And in that way, maybe the ultimate success of Black Studies is to eliminate the need for Black Studies. Or is the ultimate success in the future of Black Studies to have developed a sense of critical frames, methodologies, approaches, etc., that really becomes its own thing, that really could never be absorbed and digested by the disciplines that we've already really transformed? I mean, I think history and English departments in particular, they're so different now than because of Black Studies. Is it that we become more and more defined as Black Studies with our own methods and so forth? Or is it really to sort of finish the job that we've started in places like English departments and history departments, to make Black life so central to those that you don't really need a separate department studying it?
I think the latter. I mean, I think that the work of, for example, a history department, right, making I'm in like I teach U.S. history, right? And so the concept of teaching U.S. history without centering of Black history is like absurd to me, right? And yet that was common practice to marginalize, right? The importance of Black people as historical actors in history. And I say that to say that I think that although Black Studies has done really important work in generating those movements in the right direction, it's up to the historians to do that, right? It's up for folks in English studies to do that, theater to do that, right? I think that Black Studies has its own reason for existing, and it has to focus on that. It has to do that work. And I do think it is focused on this, creating this space for empowering Black people, and to focus on their well-being, to focus on, and of groups, right? Meaning Black peoples as groups. And I think that this notion of making all the other places better can divide the focus. I think that, and I have a foot in both worlds, right? And so, like, when I'm in the history department, like my job is like, okay, how do we make history better, and then when I'm thinking about my Black Studies work, right, I'm thinking about how we make Black Studies better. So, I come down, I think strongly marked by this passing through in Cornell's Africana program. And so I see it as having an important role in Black people understanding themselves as being able to be actors for themselves, not the servant of others, not the servant of history, not the servant of political science, right? Yeah. The servant of themselves.
I really love that way of putting it. Thank you. I think that's really, really interesting. And I think sorting out this question, I mean, it's a thing that I talk about with my colleagues, actually sharpens our for me anyway, I think it sharpens our mission and our sense of what we're doing. Like if we're building something, we should be building it towards something in the future. And if it's a future of discipline transformation, that's a whole different kind of idea of what we're doing than if it is, let's sharpen, broaden, deepen, whatever words you want, this thing called Black Studies and its distinctiveness. Yeah. Well, let me ask you a final question, and this is to, I imagine this will draw on a lot of what you've talked about already, but really just ask you in this moment, late 2024, all these, 5.5 decades of Black Studies. Today, what is the question you think we should all be asking, or what is the thing you think we should all be talking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I don't want us all questioning and thinking, talking about the same things. I think we might miss something there. But I think that we have some urgent questions that are old questions, right? Which is,
there you go.
How do we ensure that our work is clearly connected to and supporting the empowerment and well-being of Black people? Like I've said this in different ways, but I think that to not do that is to be dead in the water as a discipline. Really, I really think so. I think that there's history departments to do history. There's political science departments to do political science, right? I think that Black Studies needs to focus on that mission. And if it's not connected to the outside community, then what is it really for? And I think students come in asking this question themselves. Well, what is it for, right? I know that if I do a degree in engineering, it is to support the profession and for me to plug into that profession of engineering. I know that if I come, and I study computer science, similar thing, right? But to come and be like, oh, be in the Black Studies department so that you can make, the theater department better. There's a bit of a disconnect there. So I think that it does make sense to say, hey, the reason that this exists grows out of this activist tradition, and it is supporting the well-being of this larger collective. And this is what this work can do. And you can take it in all kinds of directions, but this is the at its core what it does. And how we make this apparent. How do we make this apparent to people? Not just doing it secretly and in quiet. Like I have I know a Black Studies scholar right now who's supporting the Section 14 struggle out of Southern California to get reparations for a community in Palm Springs that was essentially pushed out of their community, forced out of their community in the 1950s and 60s. And so they're in the middle of this court battle for reparations, right? And here we have Black Studies scholars supporting this kind of work that can have a real tangible benefit for people in the community, Black and Latinx there, right? And so I think that these are the kinds of things that we can do better. We can explain, right, how Black Studies shows up in the world in really important ways. I know it's really, really difficult to find out who's a Black Studies alum, right? There are many people. There must be now, right? We have these 50 years of folks graduate. Where are they, and what are they doing? We need to know what they are, who they are, right? So that we can understand this bigger impact. I feel like that picture was way too murky for this late stage in our discipline. And how do we ensure that we stay connected to each other and deepen? Not only in connection with each other, but in cooperation with each other, despite the institutional push for individual success.
Yeah.
How do we work together in the discipline? So I think that these are core questions that I'm thinking about for the field.
I love that. And I love the way you started that when you, I had a real reaction when you said, we have some really urgent questions, which are really old questions. That's not just the historian in you. That's the Black Studies person in you. I really I love those questions and those challenges for us, but I like also that reminder that these are the original questions, that they remain urgent. That's fantastic place to conclude, and like problems for us to think about as we listen. People listen to this as we finish this conversation, for me to think about. I really appreciate that. And this whole conversation has been really thoughtful and insightful. I appreciate your time, but I really appreciate you thinking out loud, and really putting really interesting ideas and values and challenges to us in this conversation. Thank you so much for that.
Well, I want to thank you, John. I think that the thinking about this interview has given me occasion to sit very carefully with what I do and why I do it. Why have I been doing it? And I think I feel like this is a good exercise for me to do maybe like once a year, maybe more than that. Like, what are you doing, right? And is what you're doing lining up, right, with what you say you're trying to do, right? So I appreciate the opportunity to sit and think about it with some care.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to people getting to listen in on this conversation, because I think everybody's going to come away from it with a lot to think about and a lot to say. So thank you so much again. Appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness so much.
Thank you.
And have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Take care.